So I'm just saying just a few words, because my job is easy today. I'm just engaging Leslie in a conversation. But yeah, I just want to remind you that you do have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So think about that. The other thing I want you to think about is and not only the story that Leslie's going to share tonight, but the process that he went through. Because creating strong family stories may be the most important activity that you can do. So let me explain this. So a few weeks ago, there was an article in the New York Times titled, "The Stories That Bind Us." And some of you may have read this because for about a week, this was the most popular article on the online New York Times. And it was popular because it had something very interesting to say. You know, it said, the single most important thing you can do for your family may be the simplest of all. Develop a strong family narrative. And the author made this statement based on a study looking at how children, the more they knew about their family, the stronger their self-esteem was. So they said the more children knew about their family history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believe their families function. So, and furthermore, the best predictor of emotional health and happiness was how much people knew about their family history. And the way this article ended was, the bottom line, if you want a happier family, create, refine, and retell the story of your family's positive moments and your ability to bounce back from difficult ones. That act alone may increase the odds that your family will thrive for many generations to come. And so tonight we're going to hear from Leslie, who's going to talk about his family and the ups and downs. So please give a warm welcome to Leslie.
Thanks so much, Tom. So I'm the editor of Seattle Business Magazine. I usually write about local business and economics. So when I recently sent out a mass email to my friends and contacts about my book, Yokohama Yankee, a lot of people were kind of confused. One guy complained that he bought the book by mistake, thinking it was about Ichiro's new baseball. I hope he was joking. I expect Japanese readers will also be confused. Yankee, I've just learned, is now a word used in Japan to mean juvenile delinquent. For me, the title, Yokohama Yankee, is just a way to represent the contrasting roles of East and West in the life of my family. Yokohama, of course, plays a central role in the book. It's the port city in Japan where my great-grandfather first arrived 144 years ago and where I was born and raised. It's also the place where feudal Japan first came face-to-face with Western civilization. A 30-minute train ride from Tokyo, Yokohama is Japan's second biggest city, 4 million people. It has an old world charm to it. Couples go there for romantic weekends. They like to wander through Chinatown and stroll among the old Victorian houses in the hills where I grew up. Some of you may have seen the new Miyazaki animated film, From Up on Poppy Hill. The story takes place in Yokohama, and some of the movie's scenes may remind you a little of Seattle, with its many hills and water views. When I was growing up, Yokohama was a beautiful place. This is a hill that my great-grandfather bought as a summer place at the turn of the century. I have a cousin who still lives on that hill, and when he orders sushi, he tells him to deliver to Helm, which means Helm Mountain or Helm Hill. I grew up with one foot in the foreign community and the other in traditional Japan. Among my Japanese friends and acquaintances, I tried not to stick out. I did my best to be polite, to avoid being a nuisance, and to always be respectful of my elders. I learned the value of perseverance and stoicism. I had a dentist in Yokohama who used these blunt needles that were so painful that I insisted on having my teeth drilled without Novocaine. Wow, that hurt. But I always felt good afterwards because the dentist would praise me for not crying out. When I was with my Western friends, by contrast, I let loose, breaking rules, swearing, and generally acting out. My friends and I used to climb over the chain-link fence where hundreds of Coca-Cola trucks were parked so we could steal Coca-Cola stickers that the drivers kept in steel boxes to give to shopkeepers. Now that I think of it, I wonder if it was because of gaijin kids like me that the word Yankee came to mean juvenile. Japanese was my first language because I spent much of my early years with Japanese nannies. That's a picture of me with my older brother and the two ladies who worked for us. Since I had platinum blonde hair as a child, I was always treated as a gaijin, which literally means outside person. Strangers would come up to me and touch my hair. Kids in youth school uniforms visiting Yokohama would stick their heads out the windows of the tour buses and yell, "Hey, you Yankee, you crazy boy!" Although my spoken Japanese was good, because I was educated in English, my Japanese vocabulary was far from perfect. As a kid, when my mother took us home by taxi, she would tell the driver to go to Gaijin Bochi. Since Gaijin means foreigner, I assumed Gaijin Bochi meant the foreigner's bluff, where I lived. So when Japanese asked me where I lived, I would say, "Oh, I live in Gaijin Bochi." They would give me these weird looks. It took me a while before I realized that Gaijin Bochi didn't mean foreigner's bluff. It meant foreigner's cemetery. My mother was telling the taxi driver to go there because the cemetery happened to be right across the street from my house. I was telling everybody I lived inside the foreigner's cemetery. In retrospect, I did kind of live there. It certainly housed an important part of my past. That cemetery was established in 1859 to bury the first foreigners cut down by xenophobic samurai. It is the resting place for more than a dozen of my relatives, including my Japanese great-grandmother, Hiro. In Japanese culture, taking care of the ancestral graves is an important duty. But while I used to cut through the cemetery as a shortcut to the village to grab a bowl of noodles, we never visited our family graves. It was as if my family just wanted to forget the past. Of course, when we try to bury the past, it can come back to haunt us. It wasn't until I moved to the United States for college at age 17, and I was doing my best to act like an American, that I became aware for the first time that I was 1/4 Japanese. I have two Japanese great-grandmothers. This is great-grandmother Hiro. The idea that I was part Japanese didn't make sense to me. Growing up in Japan as a gaijin, I was defined by who I was not. I was not Japanese. Being part Japanese just seemed to confuse things. Although I had many Japanese American friends, I was different from them as well. I didn't look Asian, and I had grown up in Japan, not America. So for the next 20 years, I really avoided the issue of identity altogether. Now, there are two things in life that are among the most emotional things that can happen to anybody. One is the death of a parent. The other is having children. Both things happened to me in quick succession while I was working in Japan as a reporter in the early 1990s for the Los Angeles Times. Those two things changed my world. The first shock was the death of my father. He and I had had a difficult relationship over the years, so I was surprised by the depth of my grief. But I also felt fear. Dad had never come to terms with being part Japanese. He never really found a home in either Japan or America. I was afraid the same thing could happen to me. The second event that turned my world upside down was the decision my wife and I made to adopt Japanese children. It seemed a natural thing to do at the time, but when we received a picture of a 2-year-old girl, I suddenly began to have doubts. I couldn't explain it at the time, but today I suspect it has something to do with our family's effort over several generations to hide our Japanese heritage. My grandfather, for example, was half Japanese and married a woman who was also half Japanese, yet he sometimes beat my father when he spoke Japanese at home. My half Japanese father would often complain about the goddamn Japanese. Maybe that's why the first time I met my daughter at the orphanage in Tokyo, I felt my chest tighten up. She was irresistibly cute, as you can see. But Mariko won me over. I want to read you the section in the book where I describe my first meeting with Mariko at an orphanage in Tokyo. Mariko stretched out her arms, asking to be picked up. She guided me to a basket of toys and picked out her favorite doll. Then she told me to walk to the window. I looked out the window at the small dirt playground of the jungle gym. Mariko nudged me and pointed to a colony of ants milling about on the windowsill. I knelt down so we could both get a better look. Our heads touched as we watched the ants going about their busy lives. I was totally unprepared for it. When Mariko looked up and suddenly burst into song. Arisanto, arisanto, kotsunko. Mr. Ant meets Mr. Ant walking down the way. They face this way and nod, they face that way and nod. And Mariko's voice, so filled with intensity and the sheer joy of being, seized my heart and tugged at it as though until I thought I was going to tear. When she had finished singing, I gave Mariko a hug, and she looked at me and smiled. I felt lightheaded. Then a surge of warmth. Looking back now to that summer day in 1992, I wonder if I wasn't choosing, at that moment, to affirm life and embrace Japan in a way that my father never could. Even after we adopted Mariko, in an incredible stroke of luck, we were able to also adopt my son Eric just 2 months later. I still remained ambivalent about Japan. I wondered if I could be a good father with that kind of attitude. That's what set me on the road to explore my family's long history in Japan. My book is about that journey, about my effort to rediscover the past and to reconcile my Japanese self with my Western self. Since my family story is so intertwined with modern Japanese history, the book is also about Japan's efforts as a nation to reconcile that ancient culture with a world so dominated by the West. In 1853, Commodore Perry and his fleet sailed to Japan, pointed their cannons to the shore and said in effect, "Trade with us or else." Japan had been cut off from the West, from the rest of the world for 250 years, so technologically it was far behind the West. It had little choice but to open the doors. But to keep foreigners from infecting Japanese culture, the Japanese government selected the isolated village of Yokohama and kicked out the villagers. It then built a foreign settlement on a 2-square-mile plot of land that faced the bay on one side and was cut off from the rest of Japan by rivers and canals on its 3 other sides. It's a little hard to see this, but I'm just going to walk over here. Yeah, this is the original settlement in Yokohama. This is the foreign bluff that we ended up moving to, living in. Here, in this foreign settlement, Japan could safely observe the strangely dressed men and women with the big noses who settled there. It was in Yokohama that Western technology like horse-drawn carriages, telegraph systems, and trains were first introduced to Japan. When my great-grandfather arrived in Japan in 1869, Japan was hiring foreign engineers and other experts in a mad rush to catch up with the West. They called the imported talent Oyatoi Gaikokujin, which means foreign hired hand. I guess you could call it a guest worker program. Japan believed that it needed to become militarily strong to avoid being carved up by the West, as China had been. My great-grandfather, who had fought in the Austro-Prussian War, was hired as a military advisor to a warlord in Western Japan. Great-grandfather taught the Japanese soldiers to march and build pontoon bridges. This is a picture of my great-grandfather with Japanese soldiers. I'm still trying to figure out who they are. As soon as Japan no longer needed the skills of the foreign hired hands, they were sent home. My great-grandfather decided to stay. He married a Japanese woman and worked in a variety of businesses. At one point, he ran one of Japan's first dairy farms. The milk and butter was all sold to Westerners because Japanese didn't like dairy products at the time. In fact, their term for foreigners was batakusai. Stinks like butter. Then he started his own trucking and stevedoring company. Our family business grew as Japan's economy expanded. And Japan, once afraid of being colonized, now became a colonial power. First it went to war with China and took Taiwan. Then it defeated Russia and took Korea. The second generation of my family in Japan was a pretty mixed up bunch. 2 of the brothers took German citizenship, 1 became Japanese, and my grandfather became American. All of them were educated on 3 continents, and most of them spoke 4 languages. And yet, they all struggled to establish their identity. Take the youngest one, Willie. He was German. He was a jolly fellow, loved to party. When World War I started, Japan was allied with Britain, so Germany was the enemy to Japan. Now see if you can keep this straight. Willie, who was born and raised in Japan and had a Japanese mother, volunteered to fight with German forces to protect Tsingtao, a German colony in China, from the Japanese army.
Wow.
Kind of complicated. But the point is this. Willie fought against his mother country, Japan, just to prove he was more of a patriot than any full-blooded German. He was captured and spent 5 years in a Japanese POW camp. Most of the Germans were treated well because the Japanese wanted to show the West that it was civilized. The POW camp had a printing press, an orchestra, and even allowed conjugal visits. But Willie had a tougher time than most. The camp commander played a cat and mouse game with Willie, ordering the camp barber to help Willie escape, just so the commander could send soldiers to recapture him and throw him into solitary confinement. I suspect Willie was picked because he was part Japanese. Newspaper articles at the time described Willie as mixed blood Helm. That was the headline of the article. Mixed blood Helm does this or that. Mixed blood is the same word used in Japan to describe mongrel dogs. When Willie finally returned to his family in Yokohama at the end of the war, his father had just returned from exile in Germany, and the Helm businesses were flourishing under the management of the American and Japanese brothers. But those good times wouldn't last. In 1923, Yokohama and Tokyo suffered a devastating earthquake. It was more destructive than the recent one in Fukushima because of the firestorms that spread and killed more than 150,000 people. Most foreigners left Yokohama because it looked like the city had no future. My family stayed. Yokohama was their home, and they starting from scratch, they built new barges, wagons, and warehouses. By the 1930s, the company was thriving again. In Japan's economy was also doing well, and it was chosen to host the 1940 Summer Olympics. My grandfather foresaw a new era of Japanese internationalism, and so he built a new headquarters and apartment complex called Helm House that boasted the most modern Western conveniences. At different times, this building housed members of the German Navy, the U.S. 8th Army, and the Yokohama Police Department. You've probably never heard of the 1940 Olympics in Japan. That's because they never happened. Not long after that building was completed, Japan canceled the Olympics so it could spend the money to expand the war with China. The U.S. imposed tough sanctions on Japan, and tensions rose. In August 1941, after the U.S. Embassy had warned Americans more than half a dozen times that it was unsafe to remain in Japan, my father and his family moved to California. Just months later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, an attack that triggered a wave of anti-Japanese sentiment. My father, as a teenager in California, must have felt shame then about being part Japanese. When the U.S. government ordered all people of Japanese descent to report to local authorities so they could be sent to internment camps, Dad and his family pretended the order didn't apply to them. Dad would never forget the day a local newspaper outed the family by declaring that the Helms were Japs. Luckily, they never were sent to the camps. My father ended up returning to Japan as an intelligence officer in the U.S. occupation. He arrived in Yokohama, to a Yokohama that was once again been leveled, this time by U.S. firebombs. These bombs, essentially napalm, were dropped on 20 cities across Japan and destroyed more than the 2 atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Between 200,000 and 500,000 people died in those fires, most of them civilians. Understanding what happened to my family over that turbulent century helped me to understand Dad, accept Japan, and be a better father. Yet, ironically, while adopting Japanese children and exploring my family's heritage helped me to embrace the past, in some ways, it also distanced me from Japan. Once, with 2 adopted Japanese children, I was more of an outsider in Japan than I had ever been. Once, when we were checking out of a hotel in the mountains in Japan, the manager of the hotel looked at our family and said, "So, you 2 are the teachers and they are your students?" It was absurd because the kids were then barely school age. But cross-racial adoption was so unusual in Japan at the time, the Japanese simply could not imagine that we could possibly be a family. We were happy to return to Seattle. That's a picture of my son Eric, taken by my father-in-law on July 4th. With so many mixed-race families in Seattle and adoption so common, we easily blended into the community. I did have one awkward encounter when Eric was about 3. We were shopping at QFC when Eric started running down the aisle. I ran after him, picked him up, and put him in the shopping cart. The stern but well-meaning woman came up to me and said, "Put him down." What? I said, he's my son. "Prove it," she says. That really stumped me. How do you prove that a child is your son? Finally, I just pointed to my son who was giggling in the shopping cart. "Does he look like he's being kidnapped?" I said. But for the most part, people in Seattle welcomed us, and our family life was much like any other, with all the love and tension that every family faces. I want to read a paragraph that comes at the end of a chapter about a rather harrowing raft trip my son and I took in Oregon on his 16th birthday. I was almost drowned. It was Eric who pulled me out of the water. In the months that followed, Eric, in his growing independence, was often impatient with me. I, in my frustration, sometimes lost my temper. Occasionally, there were sharp words. But somehow, since that day, I have known that life would never pull us apart, as it had my dad and me. Eric and I were not connected genetically, but on that summer day, those rapids, wild and uncontrollable, had thrown us together to reveal a bond stronger than any biological code. I knew then that my son and I would always know how much we cared for each other. If from time to time we started to slip apart, the memory of white water on that summer day would be there to pull us back together. In recent years, I have returned to Japan again and again. I have reconnected with distant relatives and rediscovered my love for that country. I have learned that we are all outsiders in different spheres of our lives. But the same thing that makes us outsiders can also make us special. It's when we embrace those things that we can add richness and diversity to the communities in which we live. Thank you. I just wanted to take a quick minute, if I may, to thank Bruce Rutledge, who founded Chin Music Press here in Seattle and took a chance on my book, and his team, which includes David Jacobson, the best editor a writer could ever ask for, and Josh Powell, a magical designer who transformed a pile of old materials I had collected into what I think you will agree is a stunning and beautiful book. I want to thank my wife, Marie, and my kids, Mariko and Eric. They are my life. My mother, Barbara, my brother Chris, and his wife Vicki, and my cousins Barbara and George are all in this room, and I feel so blessed to have their love and support. Also here is Brenda Peterson and several members of a writing group that helped and encouraged me on this journey. And thanks to all of you who have come out this evening, and to all the people everywhere who have responded so warmly to my book with posts on Facebook and on the web. Every day I feel blessed to be living in such a wonderful community. Thank you.
So does it sound okay? Yeah. So yeah, I have to do full disclosure. I've known Leslie for a while, and I'm just so excited. You know, I think it was about 10 years ago we were at your house, and I remember having a conversation. You talked about you were working on this book, and this was 10 years ago. And I kept thinking, so I wonder when the book's coming out. So this is exciting. This is I'm so proud to see you do this. It feels like a graduation. Our kids actually, this is where they graduated.
Right.
And
right.
this was kind of, for me, sort of like a graduation for you. But
thank you. It's been a long time coming, and it feels good to get it out.
So how long have you worked on this book?
So I actually, really, I mentioned my father's funeral, and I really started thinking about it around then. I started collecting materials really after we adopted the kid. So, and then I guess
didn't start seriously writing it until the mid-2000s. I had a break between 2 jobs. And then I couldn't find a publisher, and then Chin Music came along, and so in the last couple of years we just kind of nose to grindstone and got it done.
So I'm curious, when you work on a project that long, how were you changed by the process? You know, by the research, by the writing? You know, you talk about, you know, the self-discovery. I mean, how were you changed?
It's interesting. I mean, those of you who've done a lot of writing know that in many respects the truth is revealed through the actual process of writing. You have this fragments of information and emotion and all those facts you've collected, but it's not until you actually start writing that it starts to come together. And I think over the time, in some respects, it maybe took me 20 years because I needed to change as a person to finish the book.
And what were some of those changes when you think about how you were changed?
Wow. I think I had to, one was definitely looking at my Japanese heritage and understanding it. That was very, very important to me. And I think looking at my father's past, my family's past, learning what they had gone through and why and where they came from, sort of understanding where some of the attitudes that I had towards Japanese and towards Japan as a country, where that came from. And bringing that to the surface, I think, helped to finally resolve some of those issues.
Yeah, when I read the book, I really saw that. I mean, it felt a little nuanced, but I could just see this transformation from the beginning of the book. I'm sure you did this intentionally until the end, and how you had your attitude. I mean, in some ways, you know, being Japanese American. I mean, I felt like you became more Japanese by the end of the book. It was a really powerful kind of transformation for me to see.
I definitely felt more empathetic, and even actually within a couple of years as a reporter in Japan, I think I felt the difference between the beginning and even the 3-year period there. I felt a little bit more empathy towards the people I was writing about.
You know, when I was doing your introduction, I talked about how important family story is, and in particular, they talked about how it's those stories where families, they're thriving, and then they have this downfall or this catastrophe, and then they're able to fight their way back up. Was there a particular person in your family that you admired for that? When you think about all the things that happened, the wars, the earthquakes, was there someone that in your research and your writing you've really come to admire because of that quality?
Well, I think my great-grandfather was obviously an incredible entrepreneur, but somebody who just, he lost his business, started it again, lost it, started it again, and just had an enormous amount of energy. In the second generation, I think they went through a lot of difficulties. There's not a lot of record of how they responded to that, but I guess I admire all of them for having basically, they were all survivors in a sense. I think on my mother's side of the family, it's a shorter part of the book, but my mother's father also came to Japan in the 1920s, and there's a wonderful anecdote about how he turned kind of a difficult situation into actually a wonderful story. He was a professor at Tokyo University, and he was there, but he was also at Gakushuin, and Gakushuin was a place where there were a lot of spoiled kids, and the kids would be screaming and wouldn't be listening to him. And one day he just started singing, and he just kept singing and singing, and finally the students started quieting because they wanted to listen to what he was singing, and they asked him to teach him the songs. And when I was back in Japan, it was more than 10 years ago now, but I was invited by the Society for those who sing the songs taught by Professor Schinsinger. And, they had actually created this society, and I saw these 80-year-old men get up on stage and sing these old German songs. And he, I think, I admired greatly because think he found a way to relate to Japan, in spite of the gap there was for him too. He found a way to relate to Japanese.
Yeah, and when I read the book, I love those little anecdotes, and the thing that struck me, and the reason why this took you so long, was this was an incredibly well-researched book. I mean, you know, the amount of people you interviewed, the records you went back to look at, you know, both in English and mostly Japanese. In that process, what was a surprise? What was something that you discovered that just really kind of shocked you?
Well, you know, I had lots of surprises. I remember a NPR program recently that said a good story isn't good unless there's lots of coincidences, and in fact, there's just tons of coincidences in here. And I was surprised. The thing that surprised me, one of the biggest things that surprised me, is when I discovered one of my closest relatives in Japan, and he was a Shinto priest. I mean, that was pretty surprising. And then he turned out to be this incredible historian, and that too was a surprise.
And I remember the book, I mean, it seemed like the two of you had a lot in common in terms of how you went about things, in terms of both really, you know, looking at details, researching, and things like that.
Right. It was just one after another. I had another Japanese relative who was the mirror image of me. His family was Japanese, and they had hidden their German heritage. And it wasn't until his mother was on her deathbed that, you know, his uncle said, "Oh, you know, for a Japanese woman, she was pretty good woman," or something like that. For German woman, she was pretty half German or whatever it was. Anyway, it was amazing to see. And then he had followed his roots, and we were sort of connected in a way that was really.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, you know, I knew you more as a business writer.
Right.
And I'm curious how writing this book was different than when you write for like a business journal, for the LA Times. I mean, talk about that. What was different?
Oh, it's very different. I remember I was writing. Some of my friends in the writing group I was in for a while are here, and the leader of the writing group was Brenda Peterson. And I remember when I left that group to start working for Seattle Business Magazine, she was worried that I would leave that kind of zone and I wouldn't be able to continue the book. And it is very different. You've got to be in a certain space where you're going beyond logic. You're trying to find the meaning. You know, one of the things that you discover is that when you remember something, you usually remember it for a reason. You know, and what was the reason? Why did that particular anecdote stick in my mind? And you try to explore that. And you can't do that when you're writing business stories. It's a whole different process.
Well, so that's what struck me, because, yeah, I mean, in many ways, the book is pretty intimate. It's very personal, and the things you share. And did that pose problems with you personally or with family members in terms of what you shared?
It initially did. You mentioned a New York Times story about the family lines. There was another New York Times story that I blogged about not long ago. It was called "The Body Under the Rug," and it was basically talking about when you do a family memoir, one of the things that you have to accept is that you are looking at history, you are looking at family through your eyes, and that, you know, even from the eyes of my brother or my sister or my father, the world looks very different. And you are creating characters. In some cases, there are anecdotes where, you know, in one case there was, you know, maybe 4 people took a trip, but 4 people was too much, so I reduced it to 2 characters. You know, so sometimes you do things like that, and so that's, you know, that is a very different process.
You know, I have all these questions, but I want the audience to be able to ask questions too. So if you have questions, we have 2 microphones on both sides of the stage. And so go ahead and stand up there, and then when people are up there, I'll call on you. And while that's happening, we ask another question. So please just walk up there if you have a question. You know, something that was a real key event for you that stirred or sort of prompted the book was the adoption process. Right. And Why don't you talk a little bit about how difficult that was for you to adopt, just the process in Japan?
Right. The process was actually, compared to what it's like in the States, it's probably, somewhat simpler. It's actually, the process itself is quite enlightened. They have good people. They have a pretty orderly process. The problem that one faces is the attitude that Japanese have towards adoption, which is, just to try to summarize it really quickly, most adoption in Japan historically has been either a family that has all girls, and when the girls grow up, they adopt an adult son into the family, and in order to continue the family name. That's one kind of adoption. The other kind of adoption is one sibling maybe adopts the child of another sibling. And that's a very different kind of adoption from adopting a child who's from a completely different family. And that process is really still, in the early stages, is still very uncommon in Japan.
Thank you. So why don't we start over here?
My question's about purpose in writing the book. The book is very emotional and I think in some ways very risky. And there are now a lot of people who know you and a lot of other people who don't know you who are talking about the book. And I wonder what you hope to accomplish in writing this.
Good question. Tough one. When I started, it really was something I wanted to do for myself, and I did feel like it was part of this transformation I wanted to go through. And I really have to say, I kind of, it sort of reminds me of a Japanese guy I was going to write about for the LA Times, and he really didn't want me to write about it, but I said I was going to write anyway, and he said, well, I'm going to cooperate with the attitude of someone jumping off a tall building. And in a way, I felt like I just had to plunge into it, and I had to not think about the risk, and that I also had to just assume that it was going to come together, because if you think about it, it's really pretty fragmented. It's a long period of time. Every time I showed it to an agent, it was like, my God, you've got 50 characters here. I mean, it's not going to work as a book. It goes over 150 years. This is ridiculous. So so I just kind of had to do it and just hope for the best. And I think that was and I just figured if I told the truth, I tried to stick to it, that something good would come out.
So let's go over here for this question.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Can't wait to read the book. I'm curious whether or not there was a thread that was uncovered for you about your German heritage that you really weren't able to dive into because of the focus on the Japan side of the equation.
The German side is something I would definitely be, I'd love to. I still haven't even gone to Germany to see the farm where my great-grandfather was from. I definitely would be interested. I mean, one of the things I think when people start a family thing, memoir, one of the dangers of it is you want to think that you have famous, relatives. And that picture of my great-grandfather with the soldiers, initially on the back it has the names of all these. It's like having a picture with President Washington and Jefferson in one picture, but it's unclear whether that's exactly what it says. I did come across some. There's a ton of stuff out there that I'd love to explore. I'm afraid it's just such a long story. I don't even know how to go through it. My mother's side of the family is fascinating. There's tons of stuff there that if I could read German, I would love to follow.
So let's go back over here.
Hi. I too am like you. When my father passed away, I started doing research, genealogy, especially on Ancestry.com. Found a ton of information, amazing stuff. But on my mother's side, she's Japanese. My father's a Caucasian from America. Couldn't find much, and I'm wondering if there's something that I can access a Japanese website or a genealogy program like Ancestry.com. And did you use anything like that?
Not that I know of. It was really tough. I mean, when I was looking for my great-grandmother, the one piece of information I knew was the family lore was that her father was the mayor of the city called Hiratsuka. So I go to Hiratsuka and I talk to the librarian there, and they say, well, that's impossible because Hiratsuka wasn't a city at that time. It was like 10 different villages. And so I said, well, what can I do? And he said, he gives me this book, full of officials, like 1,000 names in Japanese. It's like, what am I supposed to do with this? But I actually did flip through it by chance. I actually found my great-grandmother, but it was just total chance. There's no, in fact, I would go to temples, and then they told me to find, the actual, address, which you need to, in order to look into your family registry, you need to have the address to begin with. It's like, how are you going to find the address, right? It's really, really difficult. I'm afraid, I wish I had better things to tell you.
My mother's still alive, but
yeah,
she's not hard to access. She's hard to get her to pull out those.
Yeah, you kind of have to push, I think, and then actually maybe go to Japan and connect with even the most distant relatives, and then follow up the. I don't think there's any other way. Sorry.
I first knew Leslie and Marie in Tokyo 20 years ago when he was a great reporter for the Los Angeles Times. His colleagues thought he had special access and talents that they didn't have, which is probably true. But then you came to Seattle, and I had some tickets to the ballet when I wrote. We didn't have email, and asked if you would like to use them, and he wrote back and said no, he wouldn't be allowed to accept a gift like that. Then in parentheses down at the bottom of the letter, you said, well, maybe a car. So I immediately went out and bought a brand new car and sent it to him, which he did not return. And I'm thinking about all these distinctions that we make about our different cultures and races. You're 1/8 this or 1/4 that, and how much a difference that can make. When there seems to be consensus among scientists who spend their whole lives studying these things that we all are descendants of Africans.
Right.
And I'm sure it would look quite different than most of us here in this room. It's interesting that we still make such big deals out of this. And I'm only halfway through the book, and maybe you answered this in the second half, but my question is, I hear people say the Japanese culture has changed so much, and I hear others say the core hasn't changed at all. How do you talk about that from the days of your grandfather, your great-grandfather? How have the core values of Japanese people changed in that period of time?
That's a really good question. I think in the book I address it only from the aspect of adoption, and I think adoption is an interesting lens to this whole issue, because the fact that Japanese won't or have a hard time accepting another child from a different family is, to me, is a bit of a sign of intolerance, and that I think remains today in Japan a real intolerance towards foreigners, especially people who come from the Philippines or Pakistan to work there. And Japan, which has a shrinking population, it really needs to allow more immigration, needs to attract more talent, and I think it's a huge challenge for Japan going forward.
So we are going to take one more question. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. If you are going to the upstairs event after this, please go through the inside the building. Don't leave the building. And there will also be a book signing for this event afterwards. So thank you so much, and go ahead with your question.
Throughout the book, but most compellingly in the beginning of the historical narrative, you've got dialogue and personal interaction that draws us right into the characters, especially Julius. I'm just wondering how you reconstructed and how you came up with what these people were thinking and what they were like. Because you were able to put it down in a way that made us feel familiar with it.
So I do have some, my great-grandfather wrote 60, 70-page sort of reminiscences. He didn't write in dialogue, but so there's a certain amount of what we call creative nonfiction, which is, I imagine, or it's based on, facts that I've collected. So it's fundamentally it's all it's all reality. I have to say, initially at one point went further down that path. I really tried to stick pretty much to facts, so that I was reporting on things that actually happened. Or in a couple instances, I say, I imagine this may have happened.
Tom and Leslie, this is not a question, but I can't let you stop without having the pleasure of meeting your family that might be here today. Can you introduce them to us?